I'm more worried about the algorithm of misinformation than the purveyor of misinformation. Misinformation will always be out there, but if the algorithm drives people further and further down the rabbit hole, the algorithm is the amplifier and the catalyst of extremism.
Misinformation, fake news, propaganda, echo chamber. We are hearing more and more about the prevalence of alternative facts and different polarized narratives in media. A place ruled by algorithms that do an amazing job at keeping us within our own echo chambers and confirming our own biases.
My news source is more reliable than the other side's.
A news source.
Navigating the new information ecosystem we have access to thanks to the internet is very challenging for us. The increasingly participatory nature of news sharing through various social media platforms, along with the algorithmic designs of these platforms, which personalizes information based on the likelihood of sustaining our attention and engagement, has given way to a very big problem: polarization and radicalization. Platforms have been heavily criticized recently for allowing inflammatory and divisive content to dominate narratives, often content that is strongly sensationalized or misleading or even downright fabricated. Misinformation is now more rampant than ever on social media and leads to real-life consequences.
Let's go ahead and go to the report. Pizzagate is real.
A North Carolina man arrested in a D.C. pizza shop after brandishing a gun.
Facebook coming under fire this week. The New York Times with a bombshell piece about how the social media giant handled Russian interference.
The point of mandatory vaccination is to identify the sincere Christians in the ranks, the free thinkers, the men with high testosterone levels, and anyone else who does not love Joe Biden, and make them leave immediately.
7 News gave us that ominous display of Russian military might and showed it again on the late news that night. But if you thought that formation of 10 fighter jets looked a little bit sus, well, you'd be right, because the original footage is of a Moscow air parade 2 years ago.
There has not been any proof of actual troops going into Ukraine, and the Ministry of
Sri Lanka, where we've seen an escalation of violence.
The government blocked Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Viber, saying that they were instrumental in spreading and amplifying hate speech.
A 32-year-old man has been lynched in southern India by a huge mob incensed by rumors of child kidnapping spread on WhatsApp.
Military personnel in Myanmar used Facebook as a tool for ethnic cleansing. This is not just spreading fake news.
A large call for action is being echoed by many concerned citizens asking for platforms to take responsibility and remove offending content, and sometimes even ban the user generating that content. Notably, we have seen Alex Jones being completely deplatformed after too many incidents, former President Donald Trump being banned from Twitter and other platforms after the Capitol riots of last year, and more recently talks about Spotify being asked to remove Joe Rogan from its platform after too many transgressions like spreading misinformation about COVID, as well as making dehumanizing jokes and comments about trans people, women, and black people. This then opens the door to a very important debate between the right to free speech and censorship. Should platforms be allowed to moderate content as they see fit? Are they violating the First Amendment? Who's in charge and who gets to decide?
You brought up canceling him off Twitter. I'm sorry, I disagree. When the Taliban can use our social media, but an ex-president can't, there is something wrong with that.
Did the Taliban violate community guidelines?
They've done that, and they've posted videos of stoning gay people. I agree, they should be removed, and that 100%. Is fundamentally wrong. So
Except the problem is they're smart enough to not do that.
Well,
then
okay.
Why wasn't Trump smart enough to
The president wasn't smart enough to not do that, I guess.
In today's video, we will explore what is considered misinformation, the misinformation policies of content sharing platforms, how platforms are responsible for creating filter bubbles, keeping us in echo chambers, validating our own preconceived biases, as well as some great efforts and solutions that are available at different levels to deal with this issue that is plaguing our time. So first, let's take a look at what misinformation and disinformation actually entail. Dr. Joan Donovan, an expert in misinformation and online extremism at Harvard, recently spoke about it on the Problem with Jon Stewart podcast.
When we talk about misinformation in this field, we really are talking about information that is shared where people don't know its veracity or its accuracy. Which
how does that differ from disinformation?
That's it. That's a campaign or an operation where you have people who are purposeful. There is intent there. Disinformation, to put it simply, is either it's sharing inaccurate information for mostly political ends and sometimes financial
and with
ends.
Purpose.
with real purpose and veracity and planning.
On an episode of the Your Undivided Attention podcast titled Beyond Fake News, Confronting Lethal Misinformation on Social Media Platforms, Dr. Claire Wardle, co-founder of First Draft, a nonprofit organization focused on research and practice to address mis- and disinformation, actually breaks down the 7 types of misinformation and disinformation as follows. Satire or parody, which has no intention to cause harm but the potential to fool. Fast connection, which is when headlines aren't supported by the content. Misleading content, which uses the information to frame a particular issue or person in a misleading way. False context, which is when real content is shared under false context, as we have seen multiple times recently with TikTok users resharing old footage and passing it as current footage from the war in Ukraine. Imposter content, where genuine sources are impersonated. Manipulated content, where real information or images are manipulated in an effort to deceive. And finally, fabricated content, which is completely false and constructed to deceive or cause harm. Another very scary form of disinformation that could emerge very quickly in geopolitical contexts are deepfakes.
A deepfake is essentially a piece of synthetic or fake media that's either been generated entirely by artificial intelligence or manipulated by artificial intelligence, which, by the way, includes fake video of real people saying and doing things that they never did.
Deepfakes plays into the hands of anybody, any state sponsor, any institution that wants to create confusion or deceive.
The deepfakes are a fundamental threat to democracy and to any civilization that relies on the truth. Deepfakes could very well undermine our sense of reality.
These new technologies could very soon be co-opted by foreign governments and other entities with political motives to actively mislead and manipulate the public and or governments to take actions they wouldn't otherwise take. Now that we have a better idea of what actually constitutes misinformation, time to turn our eyes to what platforms can do about it. First, let's have a look at the Communications Decency Act, or CDA, and more specifically at Section 230, which is the part that currently allows platforms to moderate content without infringing on free speech. Section 230 specifically states that no provider shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided. Ultimately, it means that platforms are allowed to police the content people post on them however they want, but are not liable for what people say on there. They also benefit from something called the Good Samaritan Clause, which states that any tech company can take down anything on their site as long as it's taken down in good faith to restrict access to material that the provider or user considers to be obscene, lewd, lascivious, and filthy. It's important to remember that the CDA was introduced in 1996, and so a lot of people are calling for a reform that would reflect a more current understanding of how platforms operate and their ultimate ability to regulate user-generated content. Let's use a current example by analyzing the recent Joe Rogan debacle with his exclusive Spotify podcast. The whole situation has been covered from every angle by everyone and their mothers, but here's the gist of what happened. The latest scandal Joe Rogan has found himself in regards misinformation about the pandemic and vaccines. And while multiple people have called out Spotify for not removing the misleading content, artists like Neil Young have tried to force the platform's hand by threatening to leave the platform. Other creators that have ongoing commitments with the platform also found themselves wrestling with the idea of sharing a platform with someone like Joe Rogan, whose values conflict with theirs. Notably, Brené Brown, who paused her 2 exclusive shows with Spotify, asking for more transparency regarding their misinformation policy. On January 30th, 2022, Spotify released their new platform rules, but it did little to reassure people's concern, as it was very vague and not particularly proactive. Social media platforms have long been moderating and removing content that does not adhere to community guidelines. But with the sheer amount of content being produced every second of every day, it's impossible for platforms to proactively examine every new piece of content for misinformation and other platform community violation. CNBC has a video covering extensively how platforms use content moderation and what are the impacts on content moderator, which are largely from overseas and can suffer a great deal mentally from exposure to offending content they are exposed to on a daily basis. I will link it down below. With cultural nuance and intent in mind, it's impossible to rely solely on algorithms to moderate these platforms, but platforms are seeking ways to take the toll off their moderators. One of the most major problems platforms face in terms of content moderation is content that is produced in other languages. According to the Wall Street Journal's Facebook Files report, more than 90% of monthly users are now outside the United States and Canada. And in terms of content monitoring, in 2020, Facebook employees and contractors spent more than 3.2 million hours searching out and labeling, or in some cases taking down information the company concluded was false or misleading, but only 13% of those hours were spent working on content from outside the US. In an episode from Last Week Tonight with John Oliver covering misinformation, particularly as it pertains to immigrant diaspora communities, they highlighted the lack of content moderation of non-English content. A certain image or post could even be labeled as containing misinformation in English, but then that same image or post would not have the same warnings in Spanish. They also highlighted the issue with the prevalence of misinformation spreading through private messaging apps, which are a preferred tool of communication in many immigrant communities for non-English content. I will link that video down below as well. Turning our attention to platforms' responsibility in perpetrating echo chambers and the involvement of algorithms in propagating misinformation, Oxford Dictionary defines an echo chamber as an environment in which somebody encounters only opinions and beliefs similar to their own and does not have to consider alternatives. The word has become quite pejorative lately, so an alternative expression has been coined by Ellie Perzer in 2011, filter bubble. A filter bubble is defined as a personal ecosystem of information that's been catered by algorithms to who they think you are. Ultimately, echo chambers sort of focus on the nature of the information, whereas filter bubbles are more concerned with what creates the boundaries, the algorithms. The formation of echo chambers and filter bubbles has eroded our capacity to talk to each other and led us down a path where we no longer share the same reality, but rather have our own polarized versions of the truth.
To fight the public health crisis that was already affecting the nation.
It was a scam to get Donald Trump out of office. It's all fake. It's my opinion.
Thanks to documentaries like The Social Dilemma, we understand a bit better how social media platforms' algorithms function. Most platforms' business models are based on capturing attention and optimizing engagement in order to maximize profits. In order to deliberately manipulate our attention, algorithms are designed to tap into our emotions, our deepest fears and vulnerabilities, and personalized recommendations. And you know what pushes our buttons like nothing else? Sensational headlines, controversial titles, and outrageous claims. A study of Twitter found that for each additional word of emotional outrage added to a tweet, it increased the retweet rate by 17%. This tool can obviously be easily co-opted and weaponized to drive extreme content and radicalization. Using micro-targeting tools and collected user data points, platforms can predict with surprising accuracy how we are likely to respond, and because their main objective is to keep us on the platform, they are likely to push us towards news that will confirm our own biases and validate the realities we have constructed for ourselves, or that they helped create and reinforce, technically. Netflix documentary The Great Hack highlighted a great instance of this perversion of social media technologies with the goal of polarizing certain groups of people in an effort to influence the 2016 US election and the Brexit campaign in the UK, among other international political events outcome. They essentially used the data points provided by Facebook, who had collected this user data, to convince what they called persuadables to vote whatever way they chose to implicitly advertise to them. Furthermore, as we have seen through the Wall Street Journal's Facebook Files report and the congressional hearings involving Facebook and its CEO last year, among many other incidents, Facebook was heavily criticized for not shutting down the Stop the Steal groups and other more extreme content that incentivized rioters to gather and attack the US Capitol on January 6th last year. Rioters had shared their plans on social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and also extensively documented the events of the day. Algorithms may have even contributed to increasing their ranks by recommending their pages and groups through their automated recommendation systems. Another great example of the weaponization of social media is currently happening to Nobel Peace Prize recipient, journalist, and Rappler co-founder and CEO Maria Ressa, who has been persecuted by the government of the Philippines for being a prominent critique of its president Rodrigo Duterte. Because a lot of the media in the Philippines is manipulating the narrative surrounding Duterte's presidency, Maria and her team have been working on trying to provide the Filipino public with trusted information and dismantling their government's propaganda campaigns. She believes there can be no integrity of election without integrity of information, as she told Kara Swisher in an episode of the podcast Sway. In the additional resources section in the description box below, I've included a documentary by Frontline on PBS available to watch on YouTube about Maria and Rappler if you want to learn more about this whole story. As we are seeing again with propaganda and disinformation campaigns happening all over Russia as we speak, governments can often co-opt social media platforms and media and completely overtake the dominant narrative. This can lead an entire population to be unable to access reliable, trustworthy information and can often mislead them into submission. There are multiple ways for platforms to move towards a more sustainable information ecosystem and reinstate trust in news. There are also a few things that we can do as individuals and as a society to help solve this misinformation crisis. Government intervention should also be on the table. First, let's look at what platforms can do. So far, relying on good faith on platforms to regulate themselves hasn't worked, and trusting that they could act as reliable gatekeepers has been costly. But it's not too late for them to start taking more responsibility for their involvement in the exploitation of misleading content for profit. A good way to start is to adopt the Santa Clara Principles, which are transparency guidelines that are designed to help tech companies to be more accountable in their content moderation. This commitment to issue transparency reports allow tech to effectively communicate what, when, and why they are taking content down, and allows users to have access to an appeal process so that meaningful due process can occur. Another way platforms can start to police misinformation more effectively is through the use of labels and warnings. We have already seen most major platforms include a COVID information label on any content that mentions the virus. In fact, you're most likely going to see one below this video. YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and just recently Spotify started including them as well. Facebook has been introducing labels that actually state the information is or could be false, but most other platforms simply are putting a disclaimer pointing to a government website for COVID information without actually fact-checking whether the information contained in the piece of content they are labeling has any validity or not. We would also need more issues to be labeled like elections, conflicts, wars, etc. There's also been research on the efficacy of contextual versus interstitial warnings, which I have read through for the purpose of this video. It found that users typically ignore contextual warning, which are the labels that do not interrupt the user's experience or compel action. Alternatively, interstitial warnings, which interrupt the user and require input before proceeding to the content the user is trying to access, similar to warnings on your browsers, often when you are at risk of accessing a website that contains malware or phishing, are far more effective. Interstitial warnings were most effective when they conveyed specific information as well as a risk of harm. Lastly, we could also hope for platforms to alter their algorithms to somehow propagate misinformation less, but as one of the Facebook file included in the Wall Street Journal reports, Facebook engineers have doubt that AI can do a good job at the moment. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the US government could reform Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to render platforms more accountable, but unfortunately, this does not seem to be a bipartisan issue, with one side of the aisle demanding less platform moderation, claiming it violates the First Amendment, and the other side pushing for stricter oversight over the power of platforms. So I doubt it's going to get anywhere anytime soon. Yay for congressional gridlock! Congresswoman Anna G. Eshoo and Congressman Tom Malinowski did introduce a Protecting Americans from Dangerous Algorithms Act in 2020. This is a legislation to hold large social media platforms accountable for their algorithmic amplification of harmful, radicalizing content that leads to offline violence. Representative Malinowski said, "What we're trying to incentivize is a change in the design of social networks, a change in how they use algorithms to amplify content so that we have less spread of extremism, conspiracy theories, inflammatory content that is designed to solely maximize engagements on the platform." Ultimately, the problem with misinformation is a global problem, so even though the big tech companies and social media companies are based in the United States, there needs to be international efforts to effectively change course in our information sharing models at a global scale. In Claire Worrell's TED Talk, How You Can Help Transform the Internet into a Place of Trust, she says that we, the people who use these technologies every day, are the ones in the best position to affect change. She suggests a model of transparency and feedback of platforms in a similar way Wikipedia has been operating, developing some kind of centralized anonymous database for research where people could donate their social data for science and give people access to what different users' experiences with personalized feed look like. And finally, to build a coordinated response with all academia, civil society, activist groups, and newsrooms working on solving different pieces of the problem to create less disjointed efforts and more cohesive solutions. Individually, we should also be more accountable for evaluating our own biases and sharing news more responsibly. Organizations like Ground News have created an incredible platform to help offer different perspectives and identify pre-existing biases and interested parties in given news stories. It distills information and gives a biased distribution of how central, left, or right-leaning the news article is, gives a factuality rating as well as the vested parties in the publication of the article or owners of the site or paper. It also links to a lot of other articles covering the same story or topic to give you a better rounded perspective of the subject. Ground News also has this really cool bias checking tool where you can evaluate your own biases. The participant of the Jubilee's Middle Ground episode that I featured a few times in this video took the test and found their respective bias scores and the factuality scores of their news sources. I encourage you to try it too, and I will have it linked in the description box. They also have a browser extension and a blind spotter tool that lets you find out the ratings of specific accounts that you follow. And no, this is not sponsored by Ground News, but it would be super cool if it was. There are a lot of organizations also working on bridging the gap of information between polarized groups, like Bravery Angels, a nonprofit organization dedicated to political depolarization by running workshops, debates, and other events where red and blue participants attempt to better understand one another or one another's positions and discover their shared value. Courageous Conversations, an organization aiming to help individuals and organizations address persistent racial disparities intentionally, explicitly, and comprehensively through seminars, consultations, and coaching. And First Draft, which was co-founded by Claire Wardle, who we talked about earlier, that is working to tackle misinformation by collaborating with journalists and partner organizations and empowering people with the knowledge, understanding, and tools. There are also a lot of English fact-checking resources like PolitiFact, factcheck.org, and Snopes. Take advantage of these resources, and if you have any other trusted resources, please leave them in the comments below, and I will add them to the list of additional resources I have compiled in the description box. Lastly, super random, I would like to share this random idea that my husband and I have been talking about, which would hypothetically be an amazing way to combat misinformation as well. We came up with this idea where there could be this one-stop shop that would be dedicated to summarizing and making all scientific research paper more digestible and accessible to everyday people. We recognize that research and data is often hard and expensive to access without academic credentials, and even more hard to understand and digest for regular people. So we hope that someday there will be a place on the internet that summarizes all of that and makes it accessible for everyone. There are already a couple organizations doing that for specific subjects, like nutritionfacts.org, which covers scientific literature on nutrition, and Evidence-Based Birth, that covers research and data on pregnancy and birth-related topics. Combating misinformation through sincere accessibility would be amazing. If we had an organization, a nonprofit platform with an easily searchable database where you could find summarized conclusions and methods and reliability of methods, clear disclosures of biases and vested interests in funding sources, it could totally revolutionize how we understand information. You can see I'm very enthused with this idea, but I will personally never see it through. Hopefully someone else will though, and that would be so cool. If you decide to roll with our idea, remember to give us credit and maybe a couple shares in the company. Just joking. Ultimately, we all need to recognize that there is a huge issue with misinformation, and one of the biggest ways this misinformation crisis is amplified is through platforms' algorithms that don't discriminate between real and false information when making personalized recommendations for users. Censoring the purveyors of misinformation can only do so much and can also only create a lot more scandal and conflict. As Brené Brown said, both censorship and misinformation are threats to public health and democracy. Rather than falling prey to believing that we have to tolerate one to protect against the other, our collective well-being is best served when we approach debates and discourse with curiosity, critical thinking, and a healthy skepticism of false dichotomies. I will leave you with that. Thanks for watching, and please share your thoughts in the comments below.